just to kind of bring our members up to date on what's been going on over the past few months. On the table, I laid out the most recent financial report. You can take a look. If you have any questions, just let me know. We're in pretty good shape. I don't see any problems. You'll see that we did receive a $2,000 grant from thank you, the Alaska Community Foundation. I lose my train. And that is thanks to Victoria Askins, who is an employee of Hillport. Many of you may know that Hillport gave all of their employees a rather large sum of money at the end of this last year to be contributed back into our community to nonprofits. And they were asked for each employee to do this by the end of this calendar year. And Victoria chose us as one of the grantors. So next time you run across Victoria Askin or anybody from the foundation, please give them my thanks. We also were able to give a $2,000 scholarship to David Martin, who is attending Green River College in Washington on the welding program. His grandmother, Paula, is here with us today.
Thank you.
So,
thank you very much. Thank you all very much. We truly appreciate it.
There's a couple of cards going around, a couple of thank you cards that I got over the summer that are going around from table to table. One of them is from David Martin. The other one is from the Russian Orthodox Church thanking us for our donation to them earlier this year. I'd like to give a brief cabin report. We opened our cabins right after Memorial Day weekend and closed them this last week, just before Labor Day weekend. Mary, our docent, did a wonderful job. She gave tours to about 600 people this summer from all over the world. Numbers were down a little bit since prior COVID, but they're picking back up as people become more acquainted with it. Of course, the weather didn't help this summer either. It was either too dry to walk around the cabins or it was so wet you would drown. So that didn't help. Mary planted some beautiful flowers in our pots at the beginning of the entryway. She kept the place watered when it was dry and kept out of the rain like the rest of us when it was wet. So we really appreciate Mary and a job well done. The cabins are they're leaking really bad, especially two of them. And we're going to start losing the artifacts and things inside the cabin. We have been trying to find somebody for 3 years now to re-roof those cabins, and we're not having any luck, so I need some help. I'm not able to take this task on anymore by myself. And Joe's out of the picture right now. He's in very bad health. So if anybody knows of anybody who would take a look at the cabins, no one seems to want to deal with tin roofs. I think that's the biggest problem in this area. So if you know of anybody or can help out and give some people calls, I'd appreciate it. Our next meeting is here in November. The October meeting is in Casilo. That's the Kenai Peninsula Association meeting. And I did receive an email from them. That will be at the fire department on the Sterling Highway. And the doors will open at 9:30 with the meeting start at 10. They're asking for you to bring side dishes like you normally do, and they're asking for an approximate count from those who might be attending. So if you can let me know, raise of hands if you think you'll be going to this meeting, I can send an email back to them and let them know. I got a call from Jack Porter just yesterday or Friday. He is asking that some of their people meet with some of our board members to see how we can give them some suggestions on how to get started. So I will be asking for a board meeting sometime during October. So give me some thoughts as to when, let me know when might be a good day for you guys to get together. Are there any questions? We have sweets on the back table, so if you want to take a few minutes and get some sweets, and then we will have our speaker. We're very pleased to have Clark Fair here. Most of you know Clark, yes.
When is the date of the November meeting?
The November meeting is on the 6th,
Thank you.
and we'll meet here again about 1:30 like we normally do. I don't have a speaker lined up for that yet, so if there's somebody you'd like to request, let me know that too. And we can start working on that. Any other questions? Okay, with that, get yourself something to eat, and we'll put Clark on board. Oh, Virginia.
Did everyone sign the guest book? Anybody that didn't? Okay, we're going to have a door prize.
I think there's somebody who did.
Clark,
You're gonna
oh,
sign
they're
up?
going to get food. Yeah, yeah. Clark, did you sign this?
I haven't signed yet.
Just stick his name on it.
I could, but I wouldn't have it.
No, just let him take the choice. One, I just.
Okay,
Number 6 must be either
I
just
have these
before
numbered.
the voting or just after the voting.
So June, you get to pick the number. From 1 to 22. Oh, just a minute. Yes, we're going to have the next one.
I need to pick another number.
Okay.
I'll pick 14.
14 is Jim Glendenny.
Of course it is.
You can take your choice. I brought several books. You can have your choice of one.
So I have 2 eyes.
You may have your choice of one, Jim.
My goodness.
He's got 2 hands. Even if one's in advantage.
Thank you, Clark. Thank you, Clark. Scholarship.
So that we can eliminate that. John Frenchy came to Tuscany Lake, I want to say in the 40s, maybe a little earlier than that. And by that time, this Frenchy was dead. So they did not overlap. All right? Yes, it does. So, almost exactly a year ago, I was standing right here doing the same thing I'm doing today. And it's kind of important for me to say this because coming here sort of led me to learn a lot of the things that I'm about to tell you. And I was here talking about 2 killings in Kenai in 1918. And one of the minor characters in that discussion was a guy named Frenchy. And at that time, I thought I knew a fair amount, no pun intended, about him, but I didn't know as much as I thought I did. And so a lot of things were about to change. So on the 12th of September, I was here, and then June sent me this Facebook message. It said, would you have any more information on P.F. Vianney, because that was the name that Frenchy went, his proper name, other than what you wrote in your article. I have an email from a man in Switzerland who is writing a book for his grandchildren and says Vianney is his father's uncle. He read parts of your article and is wanting more information. I'm kind of excited to get that. That's potentially all kinds of things out there. So I wrote back and I sent June a really long response full of all kinds of information that I had about Frenchy, and she must have forwarded it fairly quickly to this man in Switzerland, and she said, "Thank you so much. I will send it to the Swiss gentleman, who I think will be who will be pleased." And I sent back this. I said that I suggested that the Swiss gentleman and I share some information, and I gave her my email, and she sent it on to the Swiss gentleman, whose name I still did not know. And the very next day, I received an email from the Swiss gentleman. Turns out his name is Antonio Vianney. And he said, "Dear Mr. Fair, I just received the information you possess on P.F. Vianney from Ms. Harris, and I am very pleased to contact you as you appear to be the best source on him." And here's the last little bit of this. I wrote back to him and I said, "Hello, Mr. Vianney. It is exciting to hear about your connection to Peter F. Vianney. I feel confident that we are talking about the same person, despite the few differences in details we each have. My life partner, Yvonne, is Swiss, and we try to travel to Switzerland at least once every 2 years to visit her family there. Maybe we will have an opportunity in the next year or so to meet face to face." So part of what I'm going to tell you today is what I learned about Frenchy, and part of it is meeting Antonio Vianney. All right. First thing he wanted me to know was he likes to be called Reno. And if I remember correctly, in his email, he said it was like the place in Nevada. That's how you pronounce it, not to be confused with Rhino. Here's where he grew up. He lives in Switzerland now, but he grew up in Imperia in northern Italy. And this was some source of confusion for me early on, because Frenchy, P.F. Vianney, repeatedly said that he was French, that he was born in Corsica, which is French, and that he was he was the child of parents who were both born in France, and that he had served in the French military. But Reno said, that's not true, and I could prove it. So we began to go back and forth on this. Yeah, it's a good mystery. So this is where Reno was born. He now lives in Lausanne on Lake Geneva, which is a nice place to get to visit if you're going to go see someone. And this is true. One of the first things he told me was that he is the editor, or was an editor, of a book on coffee. And I thought, okay. I mean, I wasn't sure why he felt the need to tell me that. But the name of the book is Espresso Coffee, The Science of Quality, by Andrea Ely and Antonio Vianney. Turns out that both of those men have degrees in chemistry, and both of them work for the Nestle company in Switzerland. They're very smart men, and it is a very complex book on espresso. You can look it up if you want to. You can buy it on Amazon.com, but it's very scientific. It'll tell you, why coffee foams or doesn't foam, and what temperatures things should be roasted at, and what that achieves, and how much bitterness you get, or how much sweetness you get, how much flavor. It's incredibly detailed. Reno turns 89 in 2 months. And so when he told me his age, I thought, if we don't go this time, maybe he won't be around next time. I didn't know what he was going to be like. I didn't know how healthy he would be or unhealthy he would be. I just thought, if we make it to Switzerland, I need to try to get there. And so that was one of my goals. And he invited me and Yvonne to go. So that was a little extra motivation. He said, I can give you a place to stay. so we wouldn't have to pay for a hotel room. And that was pretty enticing for us, especially since, because of COVID, we had not been back to Switzerland since 2019, I think, and Yvonne really wanted to see her parents. They both live in a very small village in Switzerland, and so does her brother and his family. Before I heard of Rene Antonio Vianney, this was the only photograph I had that showed Frenchy. And I think Sharon got this for me. This was taken in Kenai in 1911 to 1912, somewhere around there, and this is Frenchy. Now, it's pretty hard to tell what he looks like. He looks like a short guy. That's about all I gathered. And standing here in the shadows, very hard to see, is a guy that I've been writing, you've been in the paper right now, a guy named Bill Dawson. And I think it said on the caption that they were store owners in Kenai, something like that. But all it said was Frenchy V. Frenchy V and Bill Dawson in front of their store, Kenai, 1911, 1912. At the time I got this photograph, I had no idea who Frenchy V was. I didn't know what the V stood for. I didn't know what his real first name was. I just couldn't figure out who this guy was. And I didn't even know for sure whether he was important, but it always bothers me when I get partial information because I tend to go down a lot of rabbit holes and try to find things out. And sometimes I burn up a lot of time that way. So the photo caption was the first thing. I don't know how many of you have read The Clenched Fist. It was written by two sisters. When they went to Alaska to begin with, they were named Alice and Willietta Dolan, and they were going to be under contract to teach in Kenai for 3 years, from 1911 to 1914, in the Kenai school. Most of their students, I mean the vast majority of them, would be native students. And they wrote about a guy named Frenchy. They mentioned him over and over and over in the book, but they never, ever, one single time mentioned his last name or his real first name. He was just Frenchy. They did the same thing with Dawson. They just called him Bible Bill. And if you've read my articles on Bill Dawson, you know that that's incredibly ironic. So that was a little bit more information. I knew that Frenchy really was in Kenai at the same time because they were there in 1911 and 1914. The photo was 1911 to 1912, so everything fit there. Then I'm working on a book with Gary Titus on historic structures of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. And one of Gary's many, many, many documents was a big chunk of the Seward Recording District records. He had gone in, and I have no idea how much time Gary spent there, but it had to be a considerable amount of time. And he saved bits and pieces. Well, it turns out that a lot of the records that Gary was interested in had to do with Andrew Berg, because he and Catherine Cassidy wrote the book on Andrew Berg. And it turns out that a guy named P.F. Vianney was involved in a lot of placer mining claims with Andrew Berg and Bill Dawson and some other folks. And once I saw Vianney, I thought maybe this is Frenchy, because it was a for sure V name and it was associated with Kenai. So I started looking at census records with Ancestry.com, and I found a P.F. and a Peter F. Vianney, who was in Kenai, was a resident of Kenai in 1900 and 1910. And then I found the passport that I had a fragment of my title slide. And then that led me to newspaper articles, and that confused me. because the newspaper articles were crazy. He was, according to these stories that he was telling, he had been on an adventure where he was dropped off on an island and expected to hunt for polar bears for the winter. He was supposed to have been on a whaling boat and a sealing boat. He was supposed to have been a miner and just done all these things. And I thought, who is this guy? I mean, how is it that there's all this stuff out there and I've never heard of him, and can all these things really be true? Please ask me, let me know if you have any questions as I ramble through this. I'm not going to go over all this, but this was the list of some of the things about Frenchy that I thought I knew before I was connected to Reno. And a lot of it I've just gone through. A couple of things that I'll point out is that up there at the top it says Peter F. Vianney is Frenchy. He was born in 1865 in Benaport in French-controlled Corsica. That's not true. And that was one of the biggest stumbling blocks to figuring out what the story of Frenchy was, because he was lying about all of that. And we'll talk about that. Yeah, Henry?
Something I was curious about reading your article is a person named Frenchy with an Italian accent. I mean, did that ever come up? I mean, how does one?
Well, if I had a copy of the Clenched Fist here, the two sisters said that because at one point right here I said that he was giving them a lavish dinner, and if you've read the Clenched Fist, you might remember that. He invited them to come over. He was living in, let's see if I've got this up here, the Kenai Agricultural Experiment Station, number 5. He was living in it. It was closed, and it was a government building, and he was living in it free of charge. He wasn't supposed to, but he was living in there, and he invited the two sisters to come over and have dinner, and he prepared them a multi-course meal, and they talked about his accent, and they said to them, it sounded like a mixture of English and French and Italian and I think Spanish and maybe even one other thing. They said that they couldn't pin down his accent. It just was all over the place. And I think that's part of the confusion. And I think that in general, a lot of people didn't know how Frenchmen were supposed to sound. You know, I really think so. I mean, we are talking about, 1900, 1910 in Kenai. I think he just sounded the way that he sounded. But I don't have a good answer for that. I wrote to a friend of mine who lives in Colorado, and I was telling her this story, and she asked me the same question you just asked, and I don't have a better answer than what I just gave you. I think that he just was a very convincing, at times a very convincing liar. Yeah.
This guy Dawson.
Yeah.
Well, there was a fellow that lived in Kenai, he was a Dawson, he was known as Barney.
Right, and he was a completely different.
Related in any way?
Not in any way, because that confused me for a while too. I ran up across Barney Dawson and tried to figure out if there was any connection, but no. As far as I know, Bill Dawson never had any children, and the only way Barney Dawson could have been related, I think, is to have been offspring. I know all of Bill Dawson's brothers and sisters, and there was no Barney. So I don't think there was any relation at all. But that's a good question. It is. So before I really got into it with Reno, I asked myself 3 basic questions. Because I've done some genealogical research in my own family, and when it comes to uncles and things like that, I'm more interested in parents and grandparents and sort of following a straight line. I don't tend to get too excited about what a cousin or an uncle or an aunt did, but he was really excited about this great uncle of his, this Frenchy, and I wanted to know why he was so interested. I wanted to know where he'd gotten his information, and did he think it was accurate, and was it accurate? Could we prove that it was accurate? And I wondered how much he could teach me, because I thought it might be interesting to write about this guy, particularly if there was a lot more information out there. So the adult in this photograph is Reno's father. His name was Giuseppe, and he went by Joe. And Reno is the little guy on the left, and his older brother, Joseph, is the little boy on the right. And it looks like comics to me. So I think he was reading the newspaper comics to his young sons. But Reno said that when he was growing up, Joe would tell them stories about this uncle of his named Frenchy, and how he'd done this whaling, and he hunted polar bears, and he had all these great adventures, and he had most of these adventures in Alaska. And remember, this is in Italy, northern Italy, and Alaska was pretty foreign. This is 1936. In this picture, Reno is 3 years old, and he was hearing about this guy who wasn't around anymore, and he wondered, could these stories be true? But he loved to have his father tell these stories. He just didn't know whether they were true or not. And then Reno started talking about this woman. He kept calling her my new cousin. He's 89 years old almost, and this woman is, I think she's about 60, and she's his new cousin. And I had to write back and forth a few times and say, what do you mean, your new cousin? I mean, how do you have a new cousin right now? And he said that he just found out that he had her. That's why she's new. Before that, he didn't know that she was his cousin. And he said, not only is she my new cousin, but she has information about Frenchy. And I'll talk about how later. Some of you have read all this and you know, but Manola, that's her name, Manola Vianney, she had information. She had, well, with her help, Reno was able to put together a family tree. She has I'll talk about the Perry-a-Lot book in a minute, but she had a bunch of photos of Frenchy, including this one, and she had a bunch of letters that Frenchy had written. Again, I was pretty skeptical, but he kept talking about all these letters. Now, this was one of the first really good photos I ever saw of Frenchy. I thought, first of all, where was this? There's wooded hillsides in the background. There's at least 2 structures in the background. And he's sitting on a pile of logs. He's got a big old beard. I thought, this is great, but I need some context. To be honest, this is one of the few photos that we have of Frenchy that we have no idea where it was. Reno's father wrote on the back that this was St. Matthew's Island. And we know that was wrong, because St. Matthew's Island has no trees on it at all. So this is not St. Matthew's Island. And as I'll talk to you a little bit later about, there was only one structure on St. Matthew Island, and there's more than one structure in this photo. So we really don't know where this was. But it was a fascinating thing to find. All right. This, I don't have a good picture of C.F. Clemens F. Perry-a-Lot, but I need to talk about him just for a minute. He was a prominent Chicago area fur dealer, and he met Frenchy probably in about 1901, and he was partly responsible for a big breakthrough that Reno had. Reno, as he grew up and became an adult, and then became a middle-aged man and then an old man, had pretty much forgotten about Frenchy. I mean, he hadn't read any of my articles or anything like that. He just knew that back when he was a little boy, his dad used to tell these stories. But then he was speaking to his niece, who was his brother's, remember he has a slightly older brother, and he was speaking to his brother's daughter, so her name was Antonella, and she said, I have something you might like to see. Now I wish I had the original here, but I don't. She pulled out this old, I'd say about 1901, 1902 booklet, and it was a really thin little book, and it was called History and Habits of the Muskox. And, you know, again, what's this got to do with Frenchy? Well, the reason I have this packet here is that, let me not get ahead of myself. She showed him this booklet, and he leafs through it, and he thinks, why is she showing me this? This is about the life and the habits of muskox. Who cares? And she said that this was, my father gave this to me, and he got it from Frenchy. And so, again, this would have been Reno's father, and somehow after Reno's father died, it went to Reno's brother, and Reno's brother held on to it for all this time. But it had originally been Frenchy's, and when he looked through it, he got to the back of it, and it quit being about muskox. And suddenly it was about these huge moose that had been killed in Cook Inlet area. And they were enormous. And written next to one of the pictures of the antlers of this moose, it said something like, it said, I killed this, 1899 or 1898, something like that. And then it was signed P.F. Vianney. And Reno looks at this and thinks, this is interesting. Turns the page, and there's another picture of a guy standing. He's holding a huge set of antlers. I think it was 78-inch spread. And he's holding it vertically like this, and it's way taller than he is. And Reno had written in pencil or something like that right next to it, I kill this, 1900. And then in the back of the book, there's like a whole letter written by Frenchy, and, well, signed P.F. Vianney, and it was written to dispute some claims of people who said they had killed the biggest moose in the world. And he went on to talk about moose that he'd killed and all these things that he knew. And Reno looked at this and thought, I got to find out more, because now he's starting to get flooded with all these remembrances of his great uncle Frenchy and the things that his dad used to tell him, and he's just dying to know more. This is just for fun. This was an article that C.F. Perrielot wrote in 1898, and I thought you would enjoy this because there was a lot of misunderstanding about moose back in those days. This moose, which has just got a drawing of it, was supposed to have a 74-inch rack. And it says right here, Professor James Ward, the naturalist, gives it in his opinion that the monster, that huge moose, must have been 100 years old. An experienced hunter places the age of the big moose at 150 years. It is reasonably safe to suppose, therefore, that the monster was somewhere between 100 and 150 years of age. Because they had, according to their experience, moose were generally unable to grow antlers larger than 40 inches across. And so to find something that was almost double that size meant that it had to be an extraordinarily old animal. Anyway, I just thought you'd enjoy that. So this is a blurry example, but you probably wouldn't want to try to read the Italian anyway. But this is one of many, many letters that Frenchy wrote. This is Frenchy's actual writing. Reno called it bad Italian. He said that Frenchy was not much of a grammarian, and after he left Italy, he didn't use Italian much, and of course he told everybody he was a Frenchman, so he really wasn't writing in Italian unless he was writing home. And so I want to give you an idea about how much work Reno did. There were something like 20 to 25 letters, all between 1892 and I think it's 1924. I might have that slightly wrong. Reno went in and transcribed every single one of these letters from handwritten Italian to typewritten Italian. He wrote them all into a computer. Then, for my benefit, because he wanted to share this information with me, he translated all of this old Italian into English and sent me the copies. That's a huge amount of work. If you've ever done any transcribing or translating, it's a huge amount of work. And he didn't just type it into Google and let Google do it for him. I mean, he literally went through all of this because he had footnotes all over the place. It was amazing the amount of work that Reno did to share this with me. And the really important thing that I need to tell you is that as I wrote right there, I had my doubts until I saw the letters. Once I started reading the letters, I knew that almost all those stories, the polar bears and all of this stuff, it was all true. Because everything lined up. Every letter that had a date on it, like that one right there, every date, it just matched up perfectly with all the things that we could prove, all the passport information and all of the census information and all the newspaper articles, it all lined up. And so Frenchy really kind of came to life through these letters. The only aggravating part of this was that Manola would send Reno some of the letters, and then Reno would dutifully transcribe and then translate the letters, and then he would send a message to Manola, do you have more? If so, send them. And sometimes she would get to it right away, and sometimes she just didn't get to it right away, and he was so impatient. And he was telling me about how much trouble she was. Yeah.
In reading all those letters, was there any one thing or two things that you picked up about his nature or personality when reading them?
Oh, yeah. And I'll get to that really soon, really soon. He was, I will say this, he was a very proud man. And as far as his parents go, he was a very defiant man. And I'll talk about that. So here's the real story of Frenchy. This was actually a letterhead, and this was P.F. Dion's letterhead. It says P.F. Dion, General Manager, Cook Inlet Fur Company. I'll talk about how that comes into play in just a little bit. He scribbled out Kenai, Alaska, and wrote Valdez. Valdez, 20th of, I can't remember what the month is, but 1906. So in America, he went by Peter. I've never seen anywhere where he ever said what the F stood for. But he went by Peter F. Vianney, and he preferred to just be called Frenchy. But his real name was Pietro Francesco Vianney. That's what he was born as.
I guess we know what that stands for.
And he was born in Villa Vianney, Imperia, Italy, on February 18th, 1865. Those are all very verifiable. He was the eldest of 7 children to live into adulthood. I believe there were 2 who died in infancy or childhood. He had 4 brothers, Agostino, Giuseppe, Luigi, and Carlo. Sometimes they are referred to as August, Joseph, Louis, and Charles. And he had 2 sisters, Teresa and Bianca. And their parents were Angela and Francesco Vianney. And it turns out that he did not serve in the French military. He served in the 92nd Infantry of the Royal Italian Army, and he had about 4 years of public school. He often would tell his sisters, I was only in school for 2.5 years, but as far as we can tell, he had 4 years of school. That's not a lot. This is pretty interesting. Reggio, I'm going to probably butcher this, Reggio Esercito Italiano means Royal Italian Army. And this right here, it says it's Certificato di, I can't remember, Tiratore or Tiratore Scelto, and it means that it's a certificate for marksmanship. He was in a regimental competition, and he finished 13th in his regiment in marksmanship, and he received a marksmanship certificate. And it's pretty important that he was considered a sharpshooter, because when he got to Alaska, he started making his living primarily as a hunter and a guide, and it helps if you are accurate. So, here is the Vianney family, except that Frenchy's not in this picture. This is, again, about 1888. The reason Frenchy's not in here, we believe he went to America in 1887, so this is probably the year after he left. This is Luigi. This is a little boy. This is Carlo. Teresa, the mother, Angela. Giuseppe, that Giuseppe right there is Reno's grandfather. This is Francesco, Bianca, and Agostino. Pretty interesting portrait. So, one of the things that I asked myself early on, and the reason it says Il Bandito, Pietro Francesco Il Bandito Vianney, leave for the United States. Why did he go in the first place? And that relates to your question about his character. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. I'm going to read a little bit what I've got right here. At the time, 1887, America had a reputation for being a place where people could get a new start if they wanted to. If they were seeking adventure, if they wanted a chance to go somewhere and make something of themselves and not be stuck in whatever situation they were in Europe or wherever they were from, America gave them an opportunity. Also, remember the father in that photograph, Francesco, he had a brother named Nicola. And Nicola had actually already gone to America about 4 or 5 years earlier, and he had settled into a place called Calumet, Michigan, and had become a copper miner. And this was a fascinating draw to Frenchy. Well, he wasn't going by Frenchy there, so I'll just call him Pietro. And so he thought, that gives me a place to start. I can go and stay at least for a while with my uncle in Michigan, and then I can decide what I'm going to do after that. But the main thing that drove him is that he did not want to be like his father. His father, remember that Frenchy is the oldest child, the oldest son. He was expected to be an olive farmer. You know, by God, we're olive farmers here in this area, and you're going to be an olive farmer. That was not in Pietro's plans, not at all. And the reason that he kept referring to himself as Il Bandito is that a bandito, besides the the criminal aspect of it, is a son who refuses to follow his father's wishes and goes off to make his own way. And that's exactly what he did. So in 1901, he wrote, this is a part of a letter that he wrote, and I think that this will show you a lot about the character of Pietro Francesco Vianney. This is what he wrote to his parents. Very dear parents, with the present letter, I am telling you that I am still alive. And I hope the same for all of you. Maybe you wish to know what I am doing. I'll tell you in one word, nothing. For 10 years, I haven't worked for anyone else but me. Now, I have skipped hunting and started life as a trader, which is nothing else but that of a gambler. Today, I buy gold mines, and tomorrow I sell them. Sometimes I gain, and some other times I lose. I move in the highest society, and I'll just say that my bed for one night costs me 15 francs. Dinner costs 10 francs. Supper from 10 to 15 francs. Now I'm in Seattle. I arrived the 4th of July, and on the 10th of July, I go back to Alaska, to Kenai. The distance from Seattle is 15 days on a ship by sea, and it cost me $62, or $120 for a round trip. Now you can imagine the level of shop that I own when I can pay $120 to stay in town for just 6 days. When you write to my brother Giuseppe, and who was in America by this time, and he'll forward the letter to me. I would have so many things to tell you. Unfortunately, it is useless to tell you, as you don't understand them. I would come home if I could, but I can't leave my shop. I have nothing more than to greet you all warmly, mother and father, brothers and sisters, and I'm forever your son, Pietro Vianney il Bandito, who didn't feel like hoeing in your garden, and you think you were right to make a boy work when he isn't born to work, but is born for something else? You want to make the ass drink when he isn't thirsty? I made more money here in Alaska than you have made in your whole life. And if you live another one, you still wouldn't do half of what I made. And now I'll tell you that I also know how to spend money, and you shouldn't forget it. So,
She told them.
that's what he wrote to his parents in 1901. All right, so there's a certain amount of defiance, very much a sense of pride in what he was doing. And I'll say this for him. When I first read that, I was like, oh my God, what an ass, you know? But he did these things. I mean, he was remarkably successful in the things that he did. I'm not saying that he was a good guy, but he was remarkably successful. All right, so that's why he left. My next question was, this is Calumet, Michigan, about 1900, a little after Frenchy was there. But that gives you an idea of the kind of place that he was briefly before he came to Alaska. My next question was, why did Pietro Francesco Vianney create a new identity for himself in America? Why did he tell everybody that he was a Frenchman when he was clearly born and bred in Italy? Why the big lie? To me, this is one of the most fascinating parts of this whole story, because if you're paying attention to the news, things haven't changed much. Immigrants were not well liked in America in the late 1880s, early 1890s, particularly what they called Mediterranean types, who were considered darker and were considered dirtier than Northern Europeans. So the people who came from Norway and Sweden and Germany, they were much better than those Italians. Not only were Italians dark and dirty, but they were Catholics. And that was a big problem. because Catholics were not well appreciated, not at all. And what surprised me as I read more information about this was that Italians, particularly Catholic Italians, were often lynched. In fact, I read that in the 1890s alone, 20 Italians were lynched. I didn't know they were taking Italians out and lynching them. I had no idea that that was the case. But my belief is, and Reno seconds this, is that Pietro Frenchy became a Frenchman because it was self-preservation. And so if he could convince people that he was from France, then they would leave him alone, because Frenchmen were okay, Italians not so much. Catholics, not so much at all. So he became a non-church-going Frenchman. All right. This was one of the first pictures that I got of Frenchy. This is Frenchy. I mentioned that he had an uncle already in America, Nicola. Nicola's two boys are this one and that one. The two on either side of Frenchy, and let's see, I think I have their names. Yeah, so that's Francesco Vianney, and on the other side of Frenchy is Giorgio. Then you have Frenchy's brothers, Luigi and Giuseppe. Those are the first and second from the end here. And the last guy over there is a cousin of theirs named Domenico Barnato. He was probably related to their mother, whose maiden name had been Barnato. I like this picture a lot. It was probably taken in the late 1890s in Calumet because the family started to break up. Many of them were gone from Calumet by 1900, 1901. But this picture, I don't know what they were trying to show, but I like the way it looks because they're all dignified, they're all wearing suits, they all have their drink, they look like they're toasting themselves, if you will, and their good fortune. But again, if you're counting from the left to the right, the second, fourth and fifth ones are all brothers. And the first and third one are brothers, but they are cousins to the other three, and then the cousin on the far end. Just real quickly, many of the Vianney family came to the United States. Bianca, the little girl, is the only one who never came. Frenchy got here and he came to Alaska in June of 1888. He probably came to America in 87. Luigi and Carlo, they visited Frenchy in Alaska. They spent part of their time in other parts of the United States. They have been very difficult for me to track, so I don't know for sure. Augustino and Giuseppe lived in Calumet. They both went to the gold rush in the Klondike in 1898, and I'm not sure how Augustino did, but Giuseppe made enough money that he was able to afford to take his whole family back to Italy in, I think, 1901. Yeah, it says 1901. And once they got there, he still had enough money left over to buy an olive mill. So he did very well for himself. Sister Teresa came and she married a cousin who's, interestingly enough, his name was Pietro Vianney, same as her brother. And they lived for a while in Los Angeles. And then I looked for what happened to Luigi and Carlo, and I just don't know. And Reno's not sure either. So I don't know what happened to them. They may never have gone home. Right about in the middle, it says Giuseppe began a family in Michigan. Reno's father was born there. When Reno's father was about 5 years old, they moved back to Italy. And so that's where Reno was raised. You don't really have to read this. This is just a summary of some parts of what I'm about to tell you. Just want to give you a sense of what Frenchy did when he came to the United States. So in 1888, he came to Alaska. I suspect that he was part of a whaling boat. He wrote in one of his letters extensively about how whaling is done. And it sounds like somebody who actually had real experience. So I think that's what he was doing, because I can't find any other period where he could have been able to do this. In 1891, he was aboard the Mattie T. Dyer, which was a sealing vessel, and they left San Francisco on this date. That summer, they dropped off Frenchy and 2 other men, Fred Burns and Jack Paulsford, on St. Matthew Island. Talked about St. Matthew just a little bit ago. The plan was that they would be picked up in the spring of 1892, and while they were there, they were supposed to hunt polar bears. It sounds kind of weird to me to think about them hunting polar bears in the middle of the Bering Sea, but apparently that was, at that time, the southern extreme range of the polar bear. And so there were apparently many polar bear on St. Matthew Island on any given winter, and they were there to hunt as many of them as they possibly could.
They have seals in it.
What do you mean?
They must have had somebody to live with.
Who, these guys?
Yeah.
No. That's a good question. Dick was asking me if they were living with some of the Eskimos on the island. At the time, there were no Eskimos living on the island. It was uninhabited, as far as I've been able to tell. And when they were dropped off there by the Mattie T. Dyer, the boat stayed there for 2 weeks. They had carried cabin logs on the boat, and they offloaded them and built a cabin for these guys. They gave them hunting cartridges and rifles and food provisions and all these things that were supposed to allow them to live for the winter while they were hunting polar bears. And so they supposedly had a big, tough cabin to live in. But at some point, on May 4th, according to Frenchy, Burns and Paulsford decided that they were going to go to the nearby island called Hall Island, which was 3.5 miles away and was known as a walrus haul island. And although it's never said that I've found, I believe they were going there because they were going to hunt walrus for a while, or maybe collect walrus ivory, or whatever they were going to do, but they never came back. They said, we'll be back in a week, and they didn't show up. And so a month later, when the revenue cutter Bear stops at St. Matthew Island, the only person on the island is Frenchy. And they get Frenchy on board, and they go over to Hall Island, and they don't find anything. There's no boat, there's no Paulsford, there's no Burns. Frenchy appears to be the only survivor. But the revenue cutter is it's a law enforcement boat, and so they're out there doing their law enforcement thing. They can't run him all the way back to San Francisco, so they drop him off at Sandpoint. I had to look this up. Sandpoint, does anybody know where Sandpoint is? You've been to Sandpoint? So correct me if I'm wrong. It's on Paw Island, and it's like one of the Shimigans,
Yeah.
just off the end of the Aleutian, the Alaska Peninsula.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that pretty much it? Okay. So that's where they dropped them off, and must have been a village there or a small community there, and he met a guy from San Francisco there named Fred Haig, and he and Fred Haig decided that they would rent somebody's schooner, and they would take that schooner to a place called Fox Cape, which is, I think, 45 miles northeast, I think, of Sandpoint, and they would set up a hunting camp there, and they would hunt all winter long and see if they couldn't raise some money. Well, it didn't work out that way. They wrecked the schooner. They got stranded at Fox Cape. They had 2 sled dogs and a sled and some provisions. And what Frenchy said was, I'll leave you with all the provisions, and I'll take the dogs and the sled, and I'll try to go back to Sandpoint. This is something that I haven't ever really completely understood, because Sandpoint is on an island, and Fox Cape is on the mainland. And I don't know how he thought he was going to get out to the island, but that was his plan. And so he took off, and he made it back to Sandpoint. And as far as I can tell, Fred Haig was never heard of again. For those of you who are interested in conspiracy theories, you might notice that he's got three missing companions so far. But I have no idea whether those were all legitimate or not. This is Sandpoint, and Fox Cape, just to give you an idea, if you're familiar with Chicknick, this should give you a sense of where this was. So, I have to read this to you. This first part has to do with Frenchy leaving Haig behind and trying to get to Sandpoint. He says, and you'll notice a lot of exaggeration here. After 15 days of travel, a terrible storm threw us to land, luckily on a sand beach, that if it had been stones, me and my companion, we would have been sure gone to pieces like the schooner. I went ashore with my rifle and 52 cartridges and a blanket, and I was wet to the marrow of my bones. Now comes the best part of the story. It is true that I was 500 miles away from any place to go. The nearest place was Sandpoint, which, as I've said, is 45 miles as the crow flies. But he said 500 miles. Away from any place to go, the nearest place is Sandpoint, an island. And I took my blanket, my rifle, and 2 Eskimo dogs with the idea that if I couldn't find anything to eat, I would eat the dogs. I let you imagine a 500-mile trip over high mountains covered with ice and snow in the month of October. How good it is to sleep with a wet blanket and an empty belly. And he just went on and was telling the story. He told the newspapers that it was 250 miles, but when he wrote to his uncle, he said it was 500 miles. A few years later, about a decade later, he was at in Indianapolis, Indiana, and he was at the Columbia Club, which was a hunting club there, and he told them this story, and this is related to hunting polar bears. He said, I saw a big fellow swimming in the sea and paddled close to him. Giving the canoe a sharp turn, I came alongside the bear and lassoed him with the anchor rope. The bear was frightened and swam at great speed, dragging the canoe through the water. I sat in the stern, steering with my paddle. The bear swam for 3 or 4 hours and then made for land. My man and I were ready for him, and before he touched bottom, we threw our canvas tent over his head. And while he fought to disentangle himself, we wrapped him in the boat's sail and more rope. Then I got a straddle of him, and pulling the rope around his mouth, twisted it tight with a stick, and so had it. I can't say whether the people at the hunting club actually believed that or not, but that's the story he told. And he said that what's that called when you drive a stake in the ground and you chain something up to it so they can kind of go around? Well, anyway, they drove a stake into the ground. They tied the bear's chain to this stake, and then the idea was the bear wouldn't be able to get away. But they said whenever they went to feed him or anything, he would snarl at them and leap at them, and he was so dangerous that they thought, we can't keep him as a pet, so eventually they dispatched him. So, Frenchy liked to tell a good story. All right. 1896. This is the earliest that I can put Frenchy at Kenai. on the Kenai Peninsula, excuse me. There's a group who put together a placer mining claim on Quartz Creek, which feeds into Lower Kenai Lake, and they did that in 1896, and he was one of the people who was involved in that claim. And this is about the same time that Shackelford was coming in there. If you read my piece on Shackelford Creek, this is about the same time that Joseph Cooper was coming in, the guy Cooper Landing, his name. And so the timing is about right. In 1897, 1898, that winter, he started living in Kenai. And he was buying and selling furs and other goods, and he was doing very well for himself. He was competing directly with the Alaska Commercial Company. And I don't know if any of you recognize this name, Eugene R. Bogart. He was, I believe, the very first postmaster of Kenai. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, he was a company official, and he had to write to his superiors in Kodiak and give them, I think, monthly updates on how things were going. And so here's what he said from these quotes here. He said, "There are a number of buyers out from the Arm, and they intercept hunting parties up on the lake and elsewhere, and they are offering in advance of prices given me last fall. Mr. P.F. Vianney, commonly called Frenchy in these parts, who has wintered here for the past 2 years, has bought furs from the natives and sold to C.D. Ladd, who was a cannery owner, and others, and has come in with a trading stock, so we have several to compete with. But notwithstanding, we have not fallen below last winter's business up to date." And then on this last one down here, he said, "There has been a good black fox caught by the Wilson boys." And those of you who know Kenai history have heard of Phil and Paul Wilson. That's the Wilson boys he's referring to. They were hunting up at Kasilof Lake, and they have been offered $90 for it by P.F. Vianney, who is trading here. It is not sold yet, and as they have other fur and intend to sell all in a lot in the spring, I may still be able to get it. So he was competing directly with them, and he was doing well, and I will show you proof of that in just a moment. Here is one little bit. This is Frenchy, and he is in Kenai with his little husky there in 1899, and he's got one pretty nice set of moose antlers. But just so you get the idea of how well he was doing, take a look at this. This is Frenchy again. There's bears and all kinds of furs, and there's sheep horns and moose antlers, and I think that Frenchy liked to show off. I think that he wanted people to believe that he was a fantastic trader and dealer and hunter, and I don't know how many of these things he killed or how many he traded for, but this is an amazing photo as far as I'm concerned. Again, 1899 in Kenai. In 1901, Frenchy, Bill Dawson, and Andrew Berg and some other men started buying and selling Tuscaloosa area placer mining claims. If you're familiar with Tuscaloosa Lake, this would have been on what's now called Indian Creek. They call it the Indian River then. They bought a lot of them. And then they turned around and sold them to the Northwestern Mining and Development Company. And I assume they made a lot of money. And then, since before 1908, 1909, you didn't have to have a license to guide. He was guiding people, and then, unbelievably, in my opinion, he became a game warden. He was probably a pretty good game warden, but he definitely had some problems. I'll get to that. This says that he was a game warden for Alaska, but he was actually one of 2 game wardens on the Kenai Peninsula, not the chief game warden for Alaska. But I like the headline.
Printed his own printing shop.
Reno and I are not sure, but we believe that this is Frenchy. There's another photograph that's almost identical to this with a different man standing there with the whip at the back of the sled. And we think they just took pictures of each other, but we're pretty sure that one is Frenchy. And that's also in the Kenai area around 1900. This is Frenchy again. Just to kind of run down a few things. He had an investment in one of the canneries at the Kenai Mouth. He had his trading post, the one that you saw the picture of with him and Bill Dawson. He, down in the Seattle and Portland area, he bought farmland. He planted grain. He had apple orchards. He kept investing his money, and almost everything he did paid off. He purchased property from small pieces, like 6-10 acres, to hundreds of acres. He became a notary in Kenai. I thought that was funny. He just kept making money. He just kept making money. Here's another picture of Frenchy showing off with a dead bear. He's got his rifle over there. He probably took these himself. But Frenchy began to miss home. He began to get sick of all the travel. He began to wish that he could spend more time with family. He never had a family of his own here. He was never married here. He never had any children. And he wrote a lot of letters home. And there was an evolution as you read through these letters of him sort of talking about how great things were here to then talking about how he missed home and then how he might be coming home and maybe only for a little while and then maybe he'd be coming home to stay. And what I want to do is just give you a quick rundown through some quick excerpts from his letters, and then this will be one of the last things about Frenchy himself. But this should give you an idea of sort of the evolution of his thought processes as he was going along. So I read you the 1901 letter where he's so defiant with his parents. This is 3 years later, so this is May 1904. He says, and this, I want to give you an idea of how much running around he did. And think about this, 1904, okay? There's not exactly a lot of roads and infrastructure around here, and this is how much he did. I am in Chicago, and tomorrow I leave for Indianapolis. I will stay there 3 days, and then I will go to Washington. I will stay there 2 days, and then I will go to St. Louis. And I will stay there 10 days, and then I will return again to Chicago. And I will go from there to Calumet to see my brothers, and then I will come home to Italy, if I am on time. And if I come, I will not stay there that long, only a few days, and then I will go back to Alaska. As you already know, I left Kenai on the 27th of February to come home to Italy, and I hope to be in Villa Vianney in the middle of June if all goes well. I mean, that's a lot. You know, when everything has to be mostly on a ship and on a train, you know, transcontinental ship. So this is a pretty amazing amount of travel. So 5 years later, March 1909, as for me coming home to stay, I must first sell what I have in Alaska: gold mines, coal mines, houses, a steam greenhouse for clamping boards, other things. I can rent the land with the apples if I don't want to sell it, but what I have in Alaska I want to sell because I'm tired of going to Alaska every summer. As soon as I can, I will sell. As soon as I can sell, I will come home, and hopefully this summer I will be able to sell everything I have in Alaska, and then I will come home for the winter. Perhaps I will stay there also in the summer. I have a good hope that this will be the case. So he's flirting with the idea a little bit here. 2 years later, in 1911, he writes, It is true that you think I don't like to write, but it is not true. So he's saying it's true that you think that, but it's not true that that is the case. I would like to write to you every day if I knew what to write. It has been so long since I have been away from home that I can hardly remember anything. I'm ashamed to say it, but it's true. I would like to come home for a year, but I'm afraid that I wouldn't be able to stay there for a week because, my dear mother, the world has taught me so many things that I can't have at home. You see, my room here has a bathroom. And I take a bath almost every day with hot and cold water in my room. I want to tell you that you live 1,000 years behind the world. I am always well dressed. My shoes are always shiny. I change the color of my shirt every day. My clothes are always clean. My handkerchiefs are always perfumed with perfume that costs me a penny. And 1,000 other things that I don't even know how to tell you. So it's so much for flirting with coming home. So then, in 1916, around Christmas time, and keep in mind that at this time, World War I is going on, he says, I don't know how to write in Italian. Maybe you don't think that's true, but I must confess my ignorance that I don't know how to write. I don't know what to say to you, only that I am fat, and that I don't do anything. And I'm in good health. And I hope the same for you. 1917. I'll show you this. He sold his store to Bill Dawson in June of 1917. He sold the store. And so now Dawson is the owner. That's not Dawson with Frenchy. That's Dawson with a guy named Captain Rose, who, if you're interested, he was, he ran a coal tender for Hebert, or I can't remember how to pronounce his name, but he was he had a coal mine over by Seldovia, and this guy ran the coal boat back and forth, dropping off loads of coal. But anyway, he sold it and he moved. It says right there he's departed for the state, so he's gone. He did come back to Alaska a time or two, but after this date, June 1917, Frenchy never again lived in Alaska. He just visited a couple of times. And so 6 months after this is what he wrote. I would gladly come to pay you a visit, but as long as there is a war, I cannot come. You don't have to be afraid of war, because with the help of the Americans, we will win for sure. We here are sure that we will win the war. We have everything we need: men, money, ammunition, ships. In the end, everything we need in war. I would pay a lot if I were younger to enter the war as a flyer. I do not know what you call them, those who go on flying machines, aviators. I think I applied for a job here, but they wouldn't take me, saying I was too old. And if I couldn't go in as an airman, maybe I could go in as a captain of the steamers that hunt the submarines. You don't have many men there. And maybe they would take an old man like me who still has a hard soul. In 1918, he wrote this: Dear parents, I'll come home as soon as I can. That is, as soon as I have the time, but not to stay there. I'd like to spend the winter there. For me, after having been in Alaska for so long, winter at home would be like summer in Alaska. I don't know what else to say, but I wish you all a happy new year, and I hope to see you soon. I mean, as soon as I can. And then the last one, from 1919, he says, you must be happy to know that as soon as I can come, I will come. At the present time, the Italian government does not seem to me to be too good with the cost of living so high. No one can say what the future of Italy will be. The war is over, it is true, but looking with open eyes, one sees that the war is not yet over. One sees strikes and revolutions all over the world. I hope that this will all soon be resolved, but to hope and to be are two different things. Here in the U.S., everything is not going well, but the U.S. is so rich that we do not feel the evil as you do. Starting this year, before this, he's been sending money home. If his sister needs some money, he'll send her money. If his other sister needs money, he'll send her money. He'll send money to his parents. But starting in 1919, he begins to send money to his brother to put into bonds for him in the bank so that he can have money in Italy when he comes back there to live. And he sends a lot. 1920 in March, he leaves. He does visit the United States, but he never again lives in America. In the clenched fist, the sisters said in their last chapter, during World War I, Frenchy was last heard from in Italy. He was in trouble with some faction there. He was without funds and begging his friends to exert influence to get him back to America. Well, he wasn't in Italy at that time. He was still in America, and we know that that's wrong. But that's what the sisters heard. They heard that he was broke, and but the truth is that when he got to Italy in 1920, the officials there referred to him as benestante, and that means wealthy. He came there with a lot of money, and he did very well for himself. And in the Pathfinder of Alaska in 1924, they wrote this: Peter F. Vianney, pioneer of the Cook Inlet country, who for many years had a trading post at Kenai, is now living in a lovely villa in southern Italy. He left the Northland several years ago, having acquired a competence there. And a competence means you got enough money to live on without having to work anymore. And that is pretty much true, except that he lived in northern Italy and not in southern Italy. But he was very wealthy. He was able to buy a villa. He was able to not work anymore. And things went very well for him, kind of. So here's the rest of the story. I mentioned this part already. Let me skip that. And when he was living in Italy in 1920, he got a housekeeper named Angela Staffarella. Keep that name in mind because, and he was still going by P.F. Vianney at first. Then he got married to Angela. She's 35 years younger than he was. They got married, and in 1925 he turned 60, just to give you an idea. So that means she was about 25. And he changed his last name to Vianney. Don't ask me why, he just changed it. So he started out in life as a Vianney, spent 3 decades as Vion, and now he's Vianney. And then he had a baby. Well, his wife had a baby. So the only child that we know of that he ever had was a son who was born on December 27th, 1924, and they named this boy Everest. It's an interesting choice for an Italian boy. And then Frenchy died just a few months later. 5 months after his son was born, he died. He had cancer, and he died. So his son grew up without knowing his father. That's Frenchy's grave. It's not the original one. The original one, I believe, was destroyed during fighting in World War World War II. But that's what exists right now. Everest grows up. He gets married, just like his dad. He has one child. That child is a daughter. That's he and his mother. And their daughter was Manolo. So the one who had all the letters and all the photographs That's his granddaughter, that's Frenchy's granddaughter. So, I'm going to switch gears for a moment. We made it to Switzerland. May, it was a great trip except for the end when I got COVID. Other than that, it was a really great trip. This is up in the mountains. We were hiking on some of these trails that you can see back there behind it. And this is me and Yvonne. And a few days after this, we were in Reno's apartment. And I just have to talk about this for a moment. Reno is quite the character. He is married to a woman named Michelle. This is a 3-story apartment. They own all 3 floors. Michelle's sister is Francine. Francine and Michelle grew up in this apartment. And when their parents died, they inherited it. So Michelle lives on the bottom floor. Her husband's name is Bob. Okay? And they both are French-speaking Swiss. All right, because this is in French-speaking part of Switzerland. They don't speak a lot of English. They speak some Italian, a few other things, but and a little bit of German, but they mostly are French-speaking women. So Francine's husband, Bob, lives most of the year in Boston. And he is very American. He grew up in Illinois, and he was a marathon runner in Boston. He's run the Boston Marathon a bunch of times, and he doesn't sound even moderately close to a European. And he just happened to be there when we visited. In fact, Bob sat here, and Francine sat here, and let's see, Reno sat over here, and Francine sat there, something like that. And Bob loves to harass Reno. They have like this jabbing sort of jovial connection where they tease each other all the time. And so it was really interesting that you'd hear all these different languages around the table, and then you hear Bob, making some fun of Reno, and especially about Reno's coffee book, because Reno said that there weren't very many copies available anymore, and Bob said, well, why don't you give yours to these guys, and then I'll sell you mine for, $200. And I know they just kind of had this thing going back and forth. But the other thing I should say is the middle floor is entirely inhabited by Michelle. Reno lives on the top floor. They don't live on the same floor. They get together, but they don't live on the same floor because it's my belief that Reno irritates Michelle so much that she would rather have him upstairs and not have to deal with him all the time. I think they love each other, but I think that she finds it extremely irritating. He used to live down the lake away and just come home every once in a while, but now he lives in the same building, and I think that they just sort of enjoy having their own separate floor. And so everything up here is pretty much Reno's. And I should point out, Reno made a lot of money doing his job as a chemist for the Nestle company, and so it has allowed him the privilege of buying things that he likes, and he likes antiques. So every piece of furniture in here is an antique. All of the glassware, all of the plates, all of the silverware, everything on the table except the food is antique. And back in the corner on the left side, that's Yvonne back there on the back side of the light, but in the corner there you see a bust on a pedestal. That is a bust of Voltaire, who wrote Candide. Reno has the a leather-bound edition. It's well over 100 years old of the complete works of Voltaire. And it's a lot. And that bust was made about the year that Voltaire died. So it is around 200 years old, and he just has all these amazing things, and he loves to talk about it. So he was just like perfect for a person who was going to go out and do the research and find out stuff and dig and dig and dig. And you know, maybe we were meant to become friends. You know, just because he's just kind of an amazing guy. This is Reno in his office. To be honest, we're pretending to study something here. I wanted something in my hand so it looked like we were doing something. But we'd just been planning the story that we were going to put in the newspaper. All right, so this is the last thing. There's like 5 more pictures here, and these are just photos that Frenchy took. I just thought this was interesting. This is Juneau, and you can see the mine there on the hillside. This is probably around 1900. He also traveled to Ketchikan. That's Ketchikan, around 1900. This is a Denina family or Kenai family with a big load of salmon. And this one was fascinating to me, cleaning out a fish trap, again about 1900.
Now we know all the fish went.
And these are both around Kenai. Then there's these last 2 pictures of Frenchy. It's really hard to see, but he's got a pipe in his mouth. It's a real long stem pipe. And he's got a dead black bear right here, so he's being manly. And this is a picture of him with a fur outfit.
He's got a bone through his head.
And then he was a member of the Masons, and Reno's father, Joseph, or Giuseppe, designed his uncle's grave marker, and he did it in order to honor his time as a Mason. I think he was a 32nd degree Mason, which is, I believe, the highest level. I'm not sure. But anyway, this was the design, and my understanding is that this was the way that Frenchy's gravestone looked before it was destroyed the first time when they had to put the new one together. And then his photo would have been in the oval there. And I think that's it. Yep. Anybody have any questions?
I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I really enjoyed your presentation. Obviously, you put a lot of work into this, but just one little thing I'm curious about. In the beginning here, you said you didn't understand why Reno was, working in Coinalco instead of the direct line. Yours, I can tell from your presentation, you're not related to any of them. How did you get so interested?
That's a really good question. I just find it very difficult to stop myself once I go down a rabbit hole. I just keep chasing down there because I don't know, I can't stop myself. I find something that makes me curious and I just can't stop.
You did an amazing job.
I appreciate it.
That story.
Does Frenchy's granddaughter have more stuff yet?
I don't know the answer to that. I have a feeling that she's probably shared nearly everything. Some of the photos that Reno sent me originally, Manola had taken, because I think she's got like a 3-ring binder, and it's got plastic sleeves in it, and she's got the letters inside plastic sleeves, so you can see the sleeves and everything. And I don't know if she sent him with all the things that are in those sleeves or not. I'd be really curious. The only other things that I have related to this family that I haven't shown, I have a lot of other photos of grave markers, but I don't have those with me. But like Everest's grave marker and Manola's mother and a few others like that. But I don't know. I would love to go to Imperia and see where they all came from. Even though it's been over 100 years, I'd love to see that place, and I'd like to meet Manola. I think it'd be fascinating to do that. And one of the things that Reno wanted was, he wanted me to save 6 copies of each Clarion. And I said, do you want the whole thing? And he said, yeah. He didn't want just the article, he wanted the whole paper. And so there were 6 parts to this story, so that was 36 newspapers. And I said, this is going to be expensive. You sure you want me to send the whole thing? And he said, yeah. It cost me $80 to send him 36 newspapers. And, it's still cool. But it's, it was kind of crazy. He was going to share those with family members. So I assumed that Manola got to see him, and I would really love to hear what she had to say. I don't know if she speaks English or not. Yeah.
Do you have any idea the meaning of the swastika and the 6-pointed star on the gravestone?
My understanding of that was that before it was transformed in meaning by Hitler and the Nazis, it was that it had to do with good health and beneficial life or something like that. I'd have to look it up again, but it was. Is it Sanskrit or something like that? Okay, yeah. So do you know the full meaning of it? Okay. But I think it's something extremely positive that was turned into something sort of terrible.
Was that a Mason's thing?
I believe so. I believe the Masons incorporated it into their, iconography.
Huh.
But I won't swear to that either. Yeah.
Well, I just saw a thing on TV the other day.
Okay.
That it was in the church, kind of a thing with the cross.
Yeah.
And he just switched it.
He turned.
Arms in it.
They turned the arms around,
Yeah.
didn't he?
Right.
Yeah,
It had to do with,
Indian art too.
in a church.
I read an article about a week ago. There's a place I want to say it's in Oregon, but I'm not positive, and it's called Swastika Mountain or something like that. There's a town somewhere, I think out on the east, and the name of the town is Swastika. And in both cases, people said, we don't want to change the name just because the Nazis came around and, polluted it. I mean, it's still a legitimate thing. It's like, do you really want to name your kid Adolf these days? Well, I don't know. It's still a legitimate name. It just kind of has a little bit of poison attached to it. Anybody else have a question?
How long did you spend in Switzerland on this trip?
The plan was 3 weeks, and then I spent an extra week because of COVID. Yeah. Yvonne and I, the deal was, in order to come back to the United States, you had to have a certificate that said that you had a negative COVID test, and it had to be within 24 hours of the time you got on the plane. So Yvonne wanted to go to Zurich and take the test and get on the plane. I said, well, if one of us is positive, that's not much time to change our plans. Why don't we just go a day earlier? So we went a day earlier, and I got a positive test just right away. And she got a negative test. She'd already had COVID in February, so that's probably one of the reasons she didn't get sick. But I did, and we had been staying with her parents, and I spent the next 5 days in her parents' basement while she got on board a plane and flew away. And then, she had to go back to work, So I changed my reservations, and I had to retake the test, again, 24 hours before. I took the test actually about 4 hours before and passed and got to come home. So it was close. It was close. So that was our vacation. Didn't go exactly as planned.
So what are you working on next?
I have 2 articles the Clarion already has. One, if somebody has information on this, I would love to have it. I did not know until this year that there had been a lodge on Lower Russian Lake near the outlet called the Russian River Rendezvous. I didn't know anything about it. And to be honest, the first time I looked it up, I learned that Russian River Rendezvous is also the name of a porn movie. And I thought, what in the heck is going on here? So I had to filter through all the porn stuff in order to try to find out what was going on. And I traced the whole history of Russian River Rendezvous before it was even called that, found out who owned it and all this, but I have had zero luck getting the Forest Service to help me out with when the permits for all of this were granted and why. There was a big plan in 1959 to build a great big new lodge there. It was going to, and remember, 1959, it was going to cost $100,000 that they were going to spend on a new lodge at Lower Russian Lake. And it never happened, and I don't know why. And I would love for somebody to say, oh, I know why. The feds burned the old one down and took away the permit, or whatever the reason was. I don't know. And the other story that I'm working on, I did this for the Readout Reporter about 10 years ago, but I came across some new information and couldn't help myself. And it's about a guy in Soldotna named Arthur Vernon Watson, who shot and killed a guy in his kitchen in 1961. And I couldn't figure out why he ever got out of prison after that, and I found out. And I have written a four-part piece that the Clarion has on that. And what I'm working on now, so I hope this isn't boring anybody, but I want to put together a history of the Lancashire family as homesteaders. And I've got a lot of information, and I'm getting ready to talk to Martha Mary, and I'm going to see what else I can find out. But I'm interested in doing that, and there's a couple of women doctors who were doctors on the Kenai in the 40s and 50s that I'm interested in writing about, and I'll see where that goes. I'm afraid you're going to ask me that because I have completely blanked on all their names. There was the first resident doctor in Kenai was a woman, and I can't. I'm spacing out on her name too, but
Dr. Goebel.
Goebel, thank you,
Yeah.
Dr. Goebel. Yep.
Here.
You did?
Yeah, she even came out we were sick and she came out to the homestead.
Wow.
Well, we were just living in a Quonset hut then. We were 4 or 5 years old. We'd go in and see her. Yeah. And then there was Nurse Tuis who had the Kenai Health Center there right where the Cars Food Center, the old Cars Mall was. She was that building. Everybody remembers that. That's where they went and got their armed folks and got shot.
Very interesting. Anything else? All right, well, thank you all.
Thank you.